The end of an era that was really two eras. An age of war under a divine and mysterious ruler. And an age of peace under a ruler who revealed himself to his people as a quiet, sensitive human. The people who lived through both gathered this morning for a final ceremony of farewell. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting from Tokyo. Good evening. It's raining outside in Tokyo this morning, so we've moved inside to the Jodo Buddhist Temple. As President Bush is taking his place for Emperor Hirohito's funeral here in Japan, trouble for one of Mr. Bush's most important cabinet appointments is deepening back home. The Senate Armed Services Committee is meeting at this hour for an up or down vote on recommending John Tower's confirmation by the full Senate. It's expected to be very close, and there are rumbles of possible defeat. Let's get a quick read now by shifting from Tokyo to Washington and Bob Schieffer. Bob?
Dan, John Tower's nomination to be Secretary of Defense appears to be in more trouble than ever tonight. Members of the Armed Services Committee are just now meeting to take a public vote on Tower's nomination, but after a 3-hour private meeting earlier this afternoon, 2 Democratic senators and 1 Republican senator told me the Democrats appear now to have the votes in committee to recommend that Tower not be confirmed as Secretary of Defense. Not be confirmed as Secretary of Defense. We'll know in the next hour how that vote comes out publicly, but at this time it appears the committee will vote against recommending Tower to be Secretary of Defense. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Bob, and we'll have more from Bob Schieffer later in this broadcast on that still developing story. Now here, not in 62 years has Tokyo seen a day like today, and never has the world seen a state funeral on this scale. Inside the imperial palace, Shinto priests have administered their last rites over the sealed coffin of Emperor Hirohito. In just a few minutes, the emperor's cypress coffin will begin its last journey through the streets of Tokyo, past crowds of onlookers. 10,000 invited guests are gathering in a national park for the formal funeral ceremonies. They include representatives of 163 countries, 55 heads of state. But first and foremost among them is the President of the United States, making his first overseas trip since he took office to be present at the dawn of a new era. Leslie Stahl is with the President.
George Bush's early announcement that he would come to the emperor's funeral was important in encouraging other world leaders to do the same, and was seen here as a symbol of the strength of the U.S.-Japanese relationship.
But even as the funeral begins, the president can't escape all of his problems, the troubled Tower nomination back home, and the sense that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev is besting him on the world stage.
Here we have a big photo out there.
Day 1 in Tokyo, a round of meetings with the leaders of Egypt, Israel, and Jordan. The president is seeking to answer criticism that he's off to a slow start in foreign policy and to dispel a perception that the Soviets are moving into a resulting power vacuum in the Middle East.
We don't see that it would be particularly helpful to have a more dominant role by the Soviet Union.
We would want to know that there were concrete contributions that they had in mind, rather than simply rhetorical exercise.
Any new American proposal?
No, we did not.
Moving around Tokyo was slow going because of tight security. But the president is managing a dizzying number of get-acquainted sessions with other leaders, what officials call grip and grins.
But I don't think any big substantive issues are going to be dealt with in any of these capitals, certainly not in Tokyo.
Little substance, but lots of stamina, with a full schedule right after 16 hours in the air. So what is his greatest challenge?
Just being awake is fine.
The president's very pleased by the course of the day so far. We're all still awake.
The president may be pleased by what's happening here in Tokyo, but he's concerned about events back in Washington over John Tower. Aides say whatever happens in committee, they expect to be able to lobby on Tower's behalf when his nomination goes to the Senate floor sometime after Mr. Bush returns to Washington on Monday. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, Tokyo.
And I'll be back in a moment with more coverage of the spectacle of the Emperor's final farewell and more on Japan and the United States at the dawn of a new era.
getting something extra in your high-fiber cereal, like sodium and added sugar? Fiber One is low in sodium and has no added sugar. So get more of the fiber your body needs and less of the stuff it doesn't. Get Fiber One.
He strained his back real bad about a week ago, and I had this free sample of Metapron.
I couldn't believe how fast it worked.
I had this awful headache, and Metapron fixed me right up.
You get heartburn. Consider yourself lucky, because now Rolaids comes in assorted fruit flavors, still calcium-rich, sodium-free, and as effective as ever. Assorted flavored Rolaids. Relief never tasted so good.
With me is my colleague Charles Geralt. And Charles, we're going to see something here today that very few people anywhere have ever seen before.
Yes, the last imperial funeral was 1927, and it was very different. It was held at night in accordance with Shinto custom. And Emperor Taisho's coffin was drawn through the streets in a carriage drawn by oxen.
But then, as now, Charles, huge crowds of people turned out to watch. The rain has kept the crowd down a bit this morning. Susan Spencer is out there watching in the rain for us at the opening point of the procession route. Susan?
We are now less than an hour away from the start of the first public part of this funeral. That's when the procession will emerge from the Imperial Palace grounds behind me and begin its 4-mile journey through Tokyo on the way to the gardens where the actual ceremonies will take place. There hardly could be a more fitting morning for a funeral. It dawned overcast with an icy rain. Still, by 6:30, small crowds had begun to gather, some people old enough to remember the war years, many too young to associate this emperor with anything but gentleness and prosperity. For a few, the promised spectacle of the event wasn't the point today. This would be a more personal farewell. These people know the palace well, and they feel they knew the emperor. For decades, they have been part of a volunteer group which has come to Tokyo twice a year to trim the imperial gardens and clean the imperial grounds. But for Ki Umoto and Shigeika Tsunohara and the rest, yesterday's visit was different. All are from Yamanouchi, a village in Japan's central mountains 200 miles from bustling Tokyo, untouched by the bombs of World War II. It was not hard to organize a pilgrimage from here. Most of the volunteers were young adults during the Second World War. As children, they were taught the emperor was a god. They say they no longer believe that, but they have journeyed a long way to say goodbye. Mrs. Tsunohara last took this train right after the emperor died to sign the Book of Condolences. At the death of the emperor, she says, something flashed through my mind. I felt like my own father was dying. Like the others, Mrs. Tsunohara thinks of the emperor as a kindly, simple man, the embodiment of Japan, a noble symbol. She has no interest in complicated questions about his role in the war, whether he could have stopped it, but how well she remembers the day when, as a student, she heard his voice for the first time, saying Japan must surrender. Young as I was, I realized that the emperor truly had had a hard time. It was so heartbreaking. The tears just kept running down my cheeks. Kiyumoto, a farmer's wife, remembers that day too. We were taught in school that the emperor was just like a god. I believed we should bow deeply and not look at him when he passes in front of us. And this very same emperor was speaking to us through the radio. Her husband heard the news on the front in Burma. The military told us, when you die, say, long live the emperor. I still have the same feeling inside me today. And after the war, the emperor did devote himself entirely to the good of the people. Late yesterday, the volunteers from Yamanouchi went to the Meiji Shrine to pray for the soul of Emperor Hirohito. The weather will no doubt keep down the crowds, but today the people from Yamanouchi are expected to witness this funeral, the most elaborate and perhaps most controversial state funeral in this century. Susan Spencer, CBS News at the Imperial Palace.
Now, Bob Simon will be along with the report, and we'll have other news in a moment, so stay here with us.
looking at a list of foods that have more fiber per serving than prunes. Prunes, the high-fiber fruit.
This spectacle, and to the Japanese very important ceremony today, is actually two ceremonies of equal length. Before the official state funeral for the emperor, there is a religious ceremony. Technically, a private family service, even though 10,000 people will be attending. Correspondent Bob Simon is at the funeral site to try to explain it.
Shinto is one Japanese product, perhaps the only one, which is not for export. It's probably as old as the first Japanese village or rice harvest. It has no theology or sense of sin or concept of an afterlife. And even the chief priest of Tokyo's Togo Shrine is a touch vague about what it is.
Shinto is originally a Japanese traditional culture and custom, I think.
That's what it is. It's Japanese. 90% of Japanese people say they're not religious, but there are 80,000 Shinto shrines in Japan. Many where you'd least expect them. And Shinto always seems to be there for the big moments, for birth and marriage and death. Big moments like when a top sumo wrestler throws beans at the devil to help local ladies chase away evil spirits. No one has ever counted Shinto gods, and no one ever will. There are too many. This tree has a god, that's clear. Rocks have gods. When the tide comes in, the water has a god too. The chief of the gods is a woman, the sun goddess, who, according to Shinto, gave birth to Japan's emperors, who are the high priests of Shinto, so their funerals have been Shinto affairs. But this time, having Shinto represented in any way at Hirohito's funeral has created confrontation in the streets, not just about Shinto, but about the future of Japan. The left has been blowing the whistle. Activists wanted the funeral entirely purged of Shinto, claiming it's too closely associated with chauvinism and racism and wartime aggression. That imperial military machine had been fueled with Shinto prayers. Kamikaze pilots flew on the wind of God.
It goes to the very unhealthy nationalism that we are very special, we are very unique, we are superior to other people. That's very unhealthy and dangerous. That's what we are worried about.
So was MacArthur. That's why the Constitution he composed for Japan has a Shinto provision, outlawing any government support of the religion. The left thinks that's fine. The right says, shouts in fact, enough noise about the war and MacArthur's Constitution. It's time to make Japan great again. These are the guys who visit Shinto shrines dedicated to Pearl Harbor pilots and to Japan's wartime leaders who were hanged as war criminals. To deny Shinto is to deny the emperor, they say, and to deny the emperor is to endanger the seasons and the cycles and the natural order which makes the crops grow and puts rice in your bowl. Serious stuff.
It's very unfortunate, isn't it, that it is used in that way, when in essence it's such a happy religion, giving tribute and thanks to nature and to your ancestors.
So this happy religion will be observed during private parts of the ceremony mostly, while the public parts are secular mostly. There has been compromise, if not consensus, and foreigners will be watching these strange rites and wondering whether the Japanese have finally learned how to feel special and unique and confident without wanting to conquer the world. Bob Simon, CBS News, Tokyo.
Coming up next, we'll be checking back in on tonight's still developing story in Washington, the Senate Armed Services vote up or down on John Tower.
Is there a better way to relieve constipation? Fiberol has more fiber than Metamucil.
Only Fiberol adds a second healthy fiber, bran.
So try Fiberol, the one with more fiber.
Powder or wafer.
Now, updating tonight's still developing headline story in Washington, the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee now meeting, poised for a vote on the John Tower nomination. Via satellite, we switch live from Tokyo to Washington and Bob Schieffer.
Well, Dan, as we said just a moment ago, the committee appears headed toward voting that John Tower not be confirmed as Secretary of Defense. This was what emerged after the committee met for more than 3 hours in private. They're now holding a public session. They have not yet begun the vote, but just a moment ago, Chairman Sam Nunn began his statement. He clearly is still concerned and has said so several times, still concerned about Tower's problems with alcohol.
That nominees must be of unquestionable integrity and suited by temperament for the demands of managing our nation's military forces. The Office of Secretary of Defense is unique in the Cabinet. The Secretary of Defense is in the chain of command for military operations, which runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the unified and specified combatant commanders in the field.
Even before the committee began deliberating the nomination, Republicans were laying the groundwork to say the Democrats were just playing politics.
If it becomes a party line vote, Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other, then I think we've had a big setback in the United States Senate.
I've not heard anyone who's served in the Senate with John Tower say that John Tower had a drinking problem.
Regardless of the committee's action, the matter won't be settled for good until the full Senate votes on it, and that won't be until the middle of next week at the earliest. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
The Senate Finance Committee voted 17-0 today to recommend Dr. Louis Sullivan's confirmation by the full Senate as Health and Human Services Secretary. That vote came after Dr. Sullivan apologized for causing what he called confusion recently about his abortion views. He said today he wants the Supreme Court to overturn its landmark ruling that made abortion legal. Chase Manhattan, the nation's second largest bank today, said it is raising its prime lending rate 1/2 point to 11.5%. That's the second increase in the key lending rate this month. Republican Congressman Donald Lukens of Ohio was indicted today, misdemeanor charges of contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Lukens denies this. The charges stem from accusations that Lukens had a sexual relationship with a teenage girl. If convicted, Republican Congressman Lukens faces up to 180 days in jail and a $1,000 fine. Mikhail Gorbachev took his first tour of Chernobyl today, site of the world's worst nuclear reactor blowout in the Soviet Ukraine 3 years ago. It's part of Gorbachev's high-visibility, Take It to the People campaign to try to prevent a political meltdown of popular support at home. Islamic Jihad vowed today to take revenge against author-in-hiding Salman Rushdie and the publishers of his novel, The Satanic Verses. That threat was accompanied by photographs of 3 Americans the pro-Iranian terror group holds captive in Lebanon: Alan Steen, Robert Polhill, and Jesse Turner. No specific threat was made against those hostages.
Not this much, just this much. New advanced formula Kaopectate works fast to relieve diarrhea and cramps, and it tastes better too. New advanced formula Kaopectate, more than ever the diarrhea specialist.
Well, a soft funereal rain is falling in Tokyo today, as we mentioned a little earlier in the broadcast. This is the scene at the Imperial Palace, where the spectacle of the final farewell for Emperor Hirohito is scheduled to begin shortly. This is the Shinjuku Gardens. Now, that's a nearby place where the official formal ceremonies will be held, a beautiful spot. Today, controversy because they're going to try to have the Shinto religious funeral along with the official state funeral, and in a thinly veiled bow to the Constitution that was imposed on Japan after the war, the Shinto part of the funeral will be on one side of a screen, and on the other side will be the official state funeral. Very complicated situation. Some 10,000 people, Charles Carroll, have been invited to attend this funeral. They'll all observe 1 minute of silence along with the nation. And everyone in Japan, all the Japanese, have been asked to join in this moment of silence, a last national observance of what's now called the Showa era.
Dan, I know one place where the silence will probably be very deep. A little mountain village in northeastern Japan. In 1926, they built a new high school there, the government did. Of course, that was the year that the Showa Emperor Hirohito ascended to the throne. And out of gratitude for the school, the people decided to rename their village Showa. Of course, the history of the village coincides exactly with the history of the Showa era. And it's a good place to think about the old era and the new one. I've been spinning flax every day for the past 20 years, she says, ever since I got too old to work in the rice fields. My children are gone. There are no jobs for them here. I do this to pass the time. Time passes slowly in Showa. The rice paddies, which provide work in summer, are covered with snow at this time of year, and the village, isolated deep in the mountains, is silent and lonely. The brightest sound in Showa comes from Miss Takahashi's music class at the elementary school. The children sing the old song about grandfather's clock, which seems, in the context of today's news, to be a parable about the life of the emperor for whom the village is named. 90 years without slumbering, tick-tock, tick-tock, his life seconds numbering, tick-tock, tick-tock. But it stopped short, never to run again, when the old man died. The high school class of 1969 gave a clock to the school, he says, but it hasn't been wound for years. Town planner Koji Igarashi is very sad about the high school. The high school was the village's reason for being, he says, the center of life. I remember when the war ended, people came here to the high school and listened to the emperor announce the surrender on the radio. They bowed to the radio, he says. But with prosperity in the cities, all the students moved away. We had to close the school. The old people are left in Showa, the old people and their memories. Mrs. Sukahara was born in the same year as the emperor, in whose name her son went off to war. When he left, she said, "I told my son, whatever you do, come home to me." But he didn't. Even Showa village, locked away from the big world, has been swept by all the winds of history. Depression destroyed Showa's silk trade. Then war killed a fourth of its young men. Now the young have heard the siren song of the cities, and prosperity is draining the strength of the village again. These children will move away too when their turn comes. They will have to, unless Japan's new era somehow reaches into these mountains to embrace them. The whole history of Showa village is in danger of stopping short, never to run again when the last old man dies. There is one bit of hope for the future, Dan, a vigorous young man who has returned from Tokyo to the village with ideas for changing things. I'll tell you about him tomorrow as Showa village lives the first day of the new era.
Charles, thank you. And that's tonight's CBS Evening News. We will continue our live coverage of the spectacle of the Emperor's final farewell, and we'll look ahead to this new era on the CBS Evening News broadcast 48 hours, coming up soon at 7 Central Time. Until then, Dan Rather with Charles Kuralt in Tokyo.
This is CBS.